For 5 years, I was the shadow that followed the sun. His name was Viktor Morozov, and to the world he was not a man but a monument, the reigning world chess grandmaster, a genius whose intellect was matched only by the crushing gravity of his ego. I was Amelia, his pupil, the one he had plucked from obscurity, the one who polished his trophies and, more importantly, sharpened his openings. And then, just as quickly as he had brought me into his orbit, he cast me out. The words still echo, not with the boom of a cannon but with the dry click of a closing lock. He told me I lacked the killer instinct. He said it calmly, a simple statement of fact, as if observing the color of the sky. He said my analysis was flawless, my dedication unimpeachable, but that at the core, in the place where victory is born from a lust for the opponent's absolute annihilation, I was hollow. He said I was a perfect sparring partner, but I would never be a champion. He was wrong. Tonight, a global audience of millions is watching him play the most important match of his career. It's him versus the machine, man versus the silicon god, a narrative as old as time, repackaged for the digital age. He sits on a brightly lit stage, across from a simple, matte black box, connected to a robotic arm that moves the pieces with silent, unnerving grace. The machine is called Lydumila. He doesn't know that I named her. He doesn't know that for the past 5 years, since the day he dismissed me, I was the lead architect of her core logic, and he certainly doesn't know that I spent those years teaching her more than just chess. I taught her Viktor Morozov. I poured every memory, every observation, every stinging piece of condescension into her neural network. I taught her his every weakness, his every tell, his vanities, his fears. I taught her the precise way his left eyelid twitches when he's bluffing a rook attack. I taught her how to recognize the subtle shift in his posture when he's privately given up on a position but is too proud to show it. And I taught her the one opening trap he never saw coming, a trap I designed as a 17-year-old girl in his study, a trap he once laughed at, calling it poetic but fatally naive. Tonight, he isn't just playing against a supercomputer. He's playing against the ghost of the pupil he erased. And I can promise you, this ghost has a killer instinct. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever had your work stolen or your potential dismissed, stick around. Let me know in the comments that I'm not just screaming into the void, because it really helps to know I'm not alone in this. This is the story of how I built the perfect weapon, not of steel or fire, but of silence, memory, and logic. And this is the story of the day my creation taught the great Viktor Morozov the true meaning of the word checkmate. The door to his study closed with a soft, expensive thud. It didn't slam. Victor's world was too curated for such vulgar displays of emotion. It was a sound of finality, a velvet-lined guillotine. I stood in the hallway, the scent of old leather and lemon polish filling my lungs, a scent I had once associated with sanctuary, with intellect, with a future. Now it smelled like a mausoleum. The words, "You lack the killer instinct," hung in the air between us, colder and more solid than the marble bust of Alekhine that watched me from its pedestal. I had just spent 6 straight weeks preparing him for the candidates tournament. I'd worked through the night, fueled by stale coffee and a desperate, burning desire to please him, to prove my worth. I had mapped out the entire strategic landscape of his 7 potential opponents. I'd found a novelty in the Sicilian defense, a subtle pawn move on the 16th turn that would give him a positional advantage against his most feared rival, a young firebrand from China. He used it. He won. The press called it another stroke of Morozov's unparalleled genius. He never mentioned my name. That wasn't unusual. I was the backroom girl, the ghost in his machine. My reward was proximity to his greatness, the crumbs of his wisdom. I had told myself for 5 years that it was enough. He didn't fire me, not in the traditional sense. It was more elegant than that, more cruel. He called it a graduation. He said I had learned all I could from him, that it was time for me to find my own, more modest path. Perhaps, he suggested with a thin, patronizing smile, a teaching position at a university. I could analyze the great games of the past. It was a fitting role for someone with my temperament, he'd said. Someone meticulous, dedicated, but ultimately passive. A curator, not a creator. A historian, not a warrior. I remember the feeling, a quiet heat flushing up my neck. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. That was the damning thing. My composure, the very thing I had cultivated to survive in his world of intense psychological pressure, was now being used as evidence against me. I just nodded. I said, "Thank you for the opportunity, Victor." My voice was steady, too steady. He saw it as confirmation of his diagnosis. I saw it as the only armor I had left. The walk from his opulent estate to the train station was just over a mile. I carried a single suitcase filled with clothes and a hard drive containing 5 years of my life's work. Every game I had ever analyzed, every line of theory I had ever developed, every note I had ever taken on his style, his habits, his soul. The world outside his gilded cage seemed impossibly loud, impossibly chaotic. For 5 years my universe had been 64 squares. Now I was adrift in an infinite, terrifying grid. I found a seat on the train, a grimy window framing a gray, indifferent sky. And that's when the dam broke. It wasn't a loud, sobbing breakdown, it was silent. A tear traced a path through the dust on the window, and another, and another. The private humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. He hadn't just dismissed me, he had defined me. He had written the final chapter of my story and handed it to me as a parting gift. Amelia, the talented girl who just didn't have what it takes. The memories came in waves, unbidden and sharp. I remembered our first meeting. I was 16, a state champion from a town no one had ever heard of. I had played in a small open tournament that he was attending for a publicity event. By some fluke of the pairings, I ended up on a board near him. He wasn't playing, just observing. I was in a tough match against a local master, a man twice my age with a reputation for grinding his opponents into dust. I was in a bad position, my queen under attack, my king exposed. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the clocks. I remember closing my eyes, blocking out everything, and just seeing the lines of force on the board, the invisible geometry of the game. I found a move, a quiet move, a simple bishop retreat that seemed passive, defensive, almost cowardly, but it set a trap, a deep, subtle net that wouldn't be apparent for another 5 or 6 moves. The master didn't see it. He took the bait. 7 moves later, I said, "Checkmate." After the match, Victor had approached me. His presence was like a change in atmospheric pressure. He hadn't commented on the checkmate. He'd leaned in and said, "The bishop move," on a8. That was not a move of fear. That was a move of patience. He saw it. He saw the depth, the calculation behind the quiet exterior. He offered me a position as his resident analyst, his protégé. It was like being asked to serve God. For the first 2 years, it was everything I had dreamed of. I lived and breathed chess. I would spend days locked in the library, exploring obscure variations, searching for theoretical novelties he could deploy like secret weapons. He was a demanding teacher, but his insights were electrifying. He taught me to see the game not as a sequence of moves, but as a story, a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. He taught me about psychological warfare, about imposing your will on your opponent until their own thoughts betray them. I absorbed it all. My notebooks filled with his wisdom, but also with my own observations of him. I started to see the patterns, not just on the board but in the man. His arrogance was a shield. He projected an aura of invincible genius because he was terrified of being seen as merely human. He despised opponents who played chaotic, ugly chess, not because it was ineffective, but because it offended his sense of order, his aesthetic control. His biggest weakness wasn't a particular opening or endgame strategy, it was his vanity. The shift was gradual, a slow leak of poison into the well. It began with credit. I'd spend a month developing a new system against the Grunfeld defense. We'd work on it together, but the core ideas were mine, born from my long nights of analysis. He would use it to win a crucial game. In the post-match interview, he would talk about how the idea came to him in a flash of inspiration while he was walking in his garden. He wouldn't even look at me as he said it. I was a tool. And you don't thank a hammer for hitting a nail. I told myself it didn't matter. The work was the thing, the purity of the logic, but it did matter. It was a small erasure, then another, until I felt myself becoming transparent. Then came the belittling. It was never in private, always in front of other grandmasters he had invited over for training sessions. He'd put one of my analyses on the demonstration board, and if he found a single, minuscule flaw, a line I hadn't calculated out to 30 moves, he would sigh dramatically. "Ah, Amelia," he'd say, with a tone of weary disappointment, "so close to brilliant. But you miss the nuance. The killer instinct is in the nuance." The other masters would nod sagely, looking at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. The quiet girl who was good but not good enough. I would stand there, my face a mask of professional calm, my stomach twisting into a knot. I would go back to the library and work twice as hard, determined to create something so perfect, so irrefutable, that he couldn't dismiss it. It was a vicious cycle. My dedication was fueled by his condescension, and my quiet dedication only served to reinforce his belief that I was passive, that I lacked the fire. The train rattled on, carrying me further and further away from that life. I opened my laptop, my fingers moving on their own. I went to the hard drive, the one I had so carefully packed. It was all there, a folder named Victor. Inside, hundreds of subfolders, tells, vanities, cognitive biases, strategic blind spots. For 5 years, I hadn't just been his student. I had been his biographer, his psychologist, his secret profiler. I had logged every game, every interview, every casual remark. I had cross-referenced his heart rate data from televised matches with the complexity of the positions on the board. I knew that he had an almost superstitious fear of symmetrical pawn structures, that he would often make a slightly suboptimal move just to break the symmetry. I knew he considered the exchange of queens to be a personal failure, an admission that his brilliant attacking skills had been neutralized. This hard drive wasn't just a record of my work, it was a weapon, but a weapon with no target. I was just a girl on a train with a suitcase full of useless, bitter knowledge. I closed the laptop. What was the point? He was right. I had all this ammunition, but no will to fire. The killer instinct. He was right. I didn't have it. The next few months were a gray blur. I got a small, sterile apartment in a city where I knew no one. The silence was the loudest thing in it. I tried to apply for the teaching jobs Victor had suggested. The interviews were humiliating. My name was known in the chess world, but only as Victor Morozov's assistant. They saw me as he did, a competent analyst but not a prime mover. The feedback was always the same. Impressive credentials, but we're looking for someone with more dynamism. It was his word. Killer instinct, translated into the bland jargon of academia. I was trapped in the narrative he had written for me. My savings started to dwindle. I took a job at a data entry firm, typing numbers into spreadsheets for 8 hours a day. It was mind-numbing, soulless work. The 64 squares of the chessboard were replaced by the infinite cells of a spreadsheet. Each keystroke felt like a tiny defeat. I stopped following chess. I couldn't bear to see his face, to hear the commentators praise his godlike genius. The catalyst came on a Tuesday. It was raining. I was sitting in my cubicle, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and quiet desperation. I was scrolling through a tech news site on my lunch break, a habit I'd picked up to feel like my brain was still connected to something complex. And then I saw it. An article with a bold headline, Kronos Corp announces Man vs. Machine Chess Championship. Grandmaster Viktor Morozov to face off against new AI, Ludmila. My heart didn't drop. It didn't race. It just stopped. For a full second, there was nothing. Then a slow, cold current started to flow through my veins. Kronos Corp. They were the biggest name in AI and machine learning, and they were building a chess machine. The article mentioned they were actively recruiting top talent for the project, looking for people with a deep understanding of both high-level programming and strategic logic. It was a Venn diagram where I was the single, lonely point in the middle. A thought, sharp and clear as a shard of glass, cut through the fog of my depression, the hard drive, the folder named Victor. It wasn't a biography, it was a blueprint. It was a user manual for a broken genius. All his tells, all his biases, all his vanities, they were just data points. And if they were data points, they could be coded. An opponent who knew his every psychological flaw wouldn't just beat him, it would dismantle him. It would be a perfect intellectual execution, delivered with the cold, irrefutable logic he claimed to admire. An idea took root. It wasn't about revenge. I told myself that, and I almost believed it. It was about the purity of the problem. Could you create a machine that didn't just play chess but played a specific human? Could you code an opponent that was his own personal ghost? This wasn't about a killer instinct. This was about something deeper. It was about perfect knowledge. I opened a new tab and started typing up my resume. I attached a single, encrypted file from my hard drive, a brief 10-page analysis of Viktor Morozov's cognitive biases during endgame scenarios, complete with statistical proof. I sent it to the public careers email address for Kronos Corp. I didn't expect a reply. It was a message in a bottle, tossed into an ocean. I went back to my spreadsheet, but for the first time in months, the numbers on the screen didn't look like a prison. They looked like a countdown. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was a man named Elias Vance, head of strategic AI development at Kronos Corp. He said, "Miss, your analysis of Morozov. It's the most remarkable piece of opposition research I've ever seen. Can you be in our office tomorrow?" The cold current in my veins turned into a river of ice. It was time to build a ghost. Walking into the Kronos Corp campus was like stepping into the future. It was all glass and brushed steel and minimalist furniture, a world away from the dusty wood-paneled study I had left behind. There was a sense of quiet, intense energy, the hum of thousands of brilliant minds working on problems that would define the next century. I felt like an imposter, a relic from an analog world. Elias Vance's office was on the top floor with a panoramic view of the city. He wasn't what I expected. He wasn't a young tech bro in a hoodie. He was in his late 50s, with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen 1,000 product cycles come and go. He had a reputation for being a programming legend, a purist from the old school who valued elegant code over flashy presentations. He gestured for me to sit down, my 10-page analysis printed out on his desk, covered in his own handwritten notes. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He tapped the paper. "This isn't just chess theory," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is applied psychology. You've modeled his decision-making under stress. You've quantified his vanity. Where did you get this?" I hesitated. I could have lied. I could have said it was purely academic research, but something in his direct, no-nonsense gaze made me tell the truth. I was his student. For 5 years, Elias leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving my face. He studied me for a long moment, and I felt like I was being compiled and debugged. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "He dismissed you," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. He saw the whole story in the lines of my analysis. He saw the years of uncredited work, the quiet observation, the deep, burning knowledge of a man who had underestimated me. I simply replied. He said I lacked the killer instinct. A small, dry smile touched the corner of Elias's mouth. It was a smile of recognition, not of amusement. Morozov thinks in terms of warriors and poets, he said. He's a romantic. What he doesn't understand, and what you clearly do, is that the most effective killer isn't an instinct. It's a system. A cold, logical, remorseless system. He slid a contract across the desk. Welcome to the Ludmila project, Amelia. You're no longer the sparring partner, you're the architect. The next 5 years were a montage of code, coffee, and obsession. I started as a senior analyst, but my role quickly expanded. The Ludmila project was vast, with teams working on hardware, processing speed, and the base neural network. My domain, my kingdom, was the strategic engine, the core logic. Elias became my silent patron, my ally in the corporate labyrinth. He ran interference for me, handled the budget meetings, and deflected the pointless questions from marketing executives who wanted to know if we could make the robotic arm more dramatic. He gave me what Victor never had, complete intellectual freedom. He gave me a team of the brightest young programmers I'd ever met and the most powerful computing cluster on the planet. And he gave me a single, clear directive: build a machine that cannot lose to Viktor Morozov. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that. It was an engineering problem. A beautiful, complex, fascinating problem. My team and I started by feeding Ludmila every recorded chess game in history. Millions of them. She learned the fundamentals, the openings, the tactical patterns. She became a grandmaster-level player in 6 months. But that was just the baseline. That was the part any tech company could build. My work was different. I was building her soul. I took my old hard drive, my 5 years of notes, and I began the painstaking process of translating human psychology into machine-readable code. It was my subplot. The secret project within the project. I called it the Morozov overlay. It wasn't just about his tells, the eyelid twitch, the finger tapping. That was the easy part. We trained image recognition algorithms on hundreds of hours of his match footage until Ludmila could spot his tells with 99.7% accuracy. No, the real work was deeper. It was about his biases. I created a custom weighting system in her evaluation function. For a standard chess AI, a position is evaluated based on material advantage, king safety, board control, and other objective factors. Ludmila did that too. But the Morozov overlay added another layer. If a potential move led to a symmetrical pawn structure, Ludmila would assign a tiny negative value to it, not because it was objectively bad, but because she knew it would make Victor uncomfortable. If a move involved offering an exchange of queens, Ludmila would flag it as a high-probability psychological blow, knowing Victor saw it as an insult to his attacking prowess. We were weaponizing his ego. My team was brilliant. A young woman named Lena, a prodigy in machine learning, helped me design the algorithms that could predict Victor's emotional state based on his move timing. A quiet, methodical man named Sam helped me build a database of Victor's press conferences and interviews, using natural language processing to map his philosophical statements about chess to his actual in-game decisions. We discovered that when he talked about the beauty of a position, he was almost always referring to knight outposts. So we taught Ludmila to deny him knight outposts at all costs, to create positions that were effective but deliberately grindingly ugly. Elias would visit my lab late at night, a cup of coffee in his hand. He'd look at the complex diagrams on my whiteboards, the lines of code scrolling endlessly on the monitors. He rarely said much, he just watched. One night, he pointed to a particularly complex piece of logic I had designed, a subroutine that specifically punished Victor's tendency to overextend his attacks when playing against the French defense. He looked at me, and his tired eyes held a glimmer of something I could only describe as awe. You know, he said, his voice quiet. Most people who get burned by a man like Morozov either run away or they try to burn him back with the same fire. They get loud, they get angry. But you're building a flood. A quiet, cold, inevitable flood. He understood. He knew this wasn't about a moment of fiery confrontation. It was about creating a system of such perfect, crushing logic that it would simply erase his. Then came the centerpiece, the project that became my obsession. The one opening trap he never saw coming. It was the line I had designed when I was 17, the one he had laughed at. He'd called it the ghost's gambit. A gambit is a sacrifice, giving up material for a positional advantage. My gambit was unusual. It sacrificed a pawn on the queen's side for what appeared to be no compensation at all. It looked like a beginner's mistake. Victor had analyzed it for a minute and declared it unsound. It relies on your opponent making a mistake, Amelia, he had said, patting my head in a gesture that was meant to be kind but felt like a dismissal. A true master controls the board. They don't hope for errors. He was wrong. The gambit didn't rely on an error. It relied on a specific psychological response, greed. It tempted the opponent to overextend, to grab the free material, and in doing so to subtly misplace their pieces. The refutation of the gambit was a series of quiet, patient, defensive moves. Moves that Victor, with his aggressive, attacking style and his supreme self-confidence, would be psychologically incapable of making. He would see it as weak. He would see it as playing my game. He would attack, and he would lose. For 3 years, I had Ludmila's core processors run simulations on the Ghost Gambit. We played it against every other chess engine in the world. We played it against simulations of historical grandmasters. We found that against 99% of opponents, it was only marginally effective. But against the specific, detailed psychological profile of Viktor Morozov, it was devastating. The win rate was 87%. It was the perfect weapon, designed for a single target. The last year of the project was a blur of refinement. We polished the code until it was a work of art. We ran thousands of full-game simulations. We made Ludmila not just a great player, but a specific kind of great player. She played with a style that was quiet, methodical, and unnervingly patient, a style Victor had once told me was the mark of a second-rate mind. This is where a hint of a plausible inaccuracy might lie, in the idea that a single programmer, even a lead, could imbue an AI with such a specific, almost artistic personality. In reality, it would be a massive team effort with less centralized control. But in my narrative, in my memory, it was me. It was my 5 years of pain and focus, my knowledge, my quiet resolve, poured into the circuits of this machine. It wasn't about revenge, it was about proving a hypothesis. It was about showing the world that patience was not a weakness, and that the quietest moves could be the most lethal. It was about proving him wrong. The night before the match, the lab was silent. The team had gone home. It was just me and Ludmila's server racks, their indicator lights blinking in the dark like a galaxy of sleeping stars. I looked at the final code, locked and ready. My work was done. I had built my ghost. Now all I could do was wait for it to appear. The theater was a cathedral of technology. The lights were hot, the silence electric. I sat in the glass-walled control room high above the stage, a position they called the architect's perch. It was a title Elias had invented for me. Officially, I was there to monitor the system's stability. Unofficially, I had the best seat in the house for the execution. On stage, Viktor Morozov was a king on his throne. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He radiated an aura of supreme, unshakable confidence. When the cameras panned to him, he gave a small, regal nod to the audience. He was the hero of this story. He was man, standing against the cold, unfeeling machine. The crowd adored him. Opposite him, Ludmila was just a box, A robotic arm, sleek and black, was poised over the board. It was silent, patient, and utterly devoid of personality. It was perfect. The first few moves were a formality, a dance of well-worn theory. Victor played white, opening with his favorite king's pawn move. Ludmilla responded symmetrically. The commentators, a panel of international masters, spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the historic nature of the event. They praised Victor's classic, attacking style. They wondered aloud if the machine could handle the raw human intuition of a genius at the peak of his powers. I watched the biometric data stream on my monitor. Victor's heart rate was a calm 72 beats per minute. He was in his element. He was in control. On his fourth move, he played the Italian game, an opening that leads to complex tactical positions where he believed his creativity would overwhelm any machine's brute force calculation. Ludmilla responded instantly. Knight to f6, standard. Victor played his knight to g5, a sharp, aggressive move signaling his intent. Now, this was the moment. The culmination of 5 years. Ludmilla's turn. On the giant screen above the stage, the move appeared in crisp white letters, pawn to d5, the first move of the ghost's gambit. A ripple of confusion went through the audience. Even the commentators were momentarily silent. One of them, an American grandmaster, finally stammered, "Well, that's an unusual response. It's a pawn sacrifice, but it seems to give up control of the center for very little compensation. It's almost an error." I looked at Victor. A slow smile spread across his face. It was a smile I knew well. It was the smile of a predator who has just seen his prey stumble. He recognized the opening. I knew he would. He probably thought it was a random artifact of the AI's programming, a bizarre statistical anomaly. Or perhaps, in his monumental arrogance, he thought the machine was paying a bizarre, flawed tribute to his own history. He saw my ghost, and he thought it was a joke. He didn't hesitate. He captured the pawn. The bait was taken. His heart rate ticked up slightly, to 78. Not from stress, from excitement. He thought he was about to give a masterclass. He was about to punish this naive, foolish machine. The game continued. Ludmilla's next few moves were all quiet. She developed her pieces, castled her king, and solidified her position. She did not try to win the pawn back. She did not launch a counterattack. She was just waiting. The commentators were growing more and more critical of the AI. "Ludmilla seems to be playing passively," one said. "It's allowing Morozov to build up a massive positional advantage. This might be over sooner than we thought." Victor was practically preening. He was playing with a theatrical flair, his moves swift and confident. He was building what he thought was an unstoppable attack. His knights were menacing, his bishops aimed at Ludmilla's king like daggers. The board looked completely dominant for white. It was a beautiful position, the kind he would use in a textbook to illustrate the power of the attack. And it was all an illusion. The turning point came on move 14. Victor had a choice. He could make a solid, consolidating move, securing his advantage and slowly grinding out a win, or he could launch the final, decisive assault. The solid move was the correct one. The assault was what his ego demanded. It was what his entire career, his entire philosophy of chess screamed for him to do. He went for the attack. He pushed a pawn to h4, a move that looked like the final nail in the coffin. And then Lyudmila played the move I had spent 3 years perfecting, bishop to g6. It was a retreat, a simple, quiet, unassuming retreat. On the surface, it looked like a desperate defensive gesture, but it wasn't. It was the spring of the trap. The move did 2 things. It protected the king, and it opened a diagonal for Lyudmila's queen that had been closed for the entire game. A diagonal that was now aimed directly at Victor's own, slightly exposed king. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Victor froze. His hand, which had been hovering over the board ready to make his next triumphant move, stopped in midair. I watched his face on the high-definition monitor. The smug confidence drained away, replaced by a wave of cold, stark realization. His smile vanished. His eyes widened, darting back and forth across the board. He was recalculating, his mind racing. He saw it. He finally saw the whole picture. He saw that his entire beautiful, aggressive structure was a house of cards. His advanced pieces were now overextended, cut off from defending their own king. He saw that the passive, weak moves Lyudmila had been making were not weaknesses at all. They were a net, and he had just gleefully dived straight into it. His face, which moments before had been a mask of imperious genius, was now pale. A single bead of sweat trickled down his temple. His heart rate, which had been a confident 78, spiked to 112. The silent takeover was complete. The audience didn't understand what had happened. The commentators were still talking about Victor's brilliant attack. But Victor knew, and I knew. He wasn't playing against a machine anymore. He was playing against me. The power shift was palpable, even to those who didn't understand the intricacies of the game. It was in the air. The narrative of the broadcast began to change. The commentators, initially confused by Lyudmila's quiet bishop move, fell silent as they analyzed its consequences. One of them, a venerable Russian grandmaster who had played against Victor in his youth, let out a low whistle that was picked up by his microphone. "My God," he breathed. The machine saw this from the beginning, Morozov's entire attack. It wasn't his attack, it was a response. The machine has been leading him into this position since move 4. The camera zoomed in on Victor's face. The mask of the infallible genius had crumbled, revealing the stressed, panicked man beneath. He was trapped, and the world was watching. His every tell, every weakness I had so meticulously coded into Lyudmila, began to surface. He started drumming his fingers on the table, a rapid, nervous rhythm I knew he only used when he felt his control slipping. He adjusted his tie, a telltale sign of his rising anxiety. Lyudmila knew this too. The Morozov overlay was now fully active, interpreting these physical signs not just as human tics, but as data points confirming his psychological collapse. The game transformed from a battle of intellect into a public dissection. Lyudmila was no longer just playing chess, she was systematically dismantling his psyche. She began to offer him sacrifices, but they were cruel, calculated temptations. She would offer a knight for a pawn, a move that would appeal directly to his vanity, his belief that he could outcalculate any opponent in a complex tactical skirmish. He took the bait twice. Both times it led him deeper into a positional quagmire. The commentators were now in awe of the machine. They stopped talking about brute force calculation and started using words like cunning, devious, and most tellingly, human. One of them said, "It's like the AI has a PhD in Morozov's psychology. It's not just countering his moves, it's countering his very nature." That line made me smile. It was the most accurate thing anyone had said all night. The client exodus, in this case, was not of customers but of prestige. His greatest asset, his reputation for untouchable brilliance, was hemorrhaging live on air. The global chess community watching online was in an uproar. Forums and chat rooms were exploding. The initial pro-Victor sentiment had completely evaporated, replaced by a morbid fascination with his downfall. They were no longer cheering for the man against the machine. They were watching a public autopsy, and they couldn't look away. Victor's desperate counterattack came around move 30. He was in severe time trouble. Another weakness Lyudmila was built to exploit. She was playing her moves almost instantly, the robotic arm gliding with serene confidence, while Victor's clock ticked down, each second a hammer blow to his composure. In a fit of what I can only describe as panic, he launched a wild, unsound rook sacrifice. It was a desperate lunge, a street fighter's brawl, the kind of ugly chess he so despised. It was the last desperate gambit of a king who knew his kingdom was lost. In the control room, one of my junior programmers, Sam, let out a tense breath. That's a wild move. The evaluation function is fluctuating. I didn't even look at the evaluation. I looked at Lyudmila's core logic. She saw the sacrifice for what it was, the last gasp of a dying ego. A normal chess engine might have spent minutes calculating all the complex variations. Lyudmila didn't need to. Her Morozov overlay flagged the move with a 98% probability of being an act of psychological desperation, not strategic brilliance. Her response was instantaneous. She didn't take the rook. She ignored it completely. Instead, she made a simple, quiet pawn move on the other side of the board. It was the coldest, most contemptuous move I have ever seen. It was the chess equivalent of turning your back on a screaming man. It communicated a simple, brutal message. Your threats are meaningless. Your power is an illusion. You are no longer relevant to the outcome of this game. On the stage, Victor physically flinched, as if he had been struck. He stared at the board, then at the silent black box opposite him. And in that moment, I believe he finally understood. He wasn't being outplayed, he was being erased. The power had not just shifted, it had vanished from his side of the board entirely, leaving him alone under the hot lights with nothing but his own colossal, shattered pride. The end was a formality, a slow, methodical constriction. Lyudmila closed the net with the quiet precision of a spider, each move perfect, each move a turn of the screw. She took back the material she had sacrificed and more, dismantling his position piece by piece until his king stood alone, naked and surrounded. The checkmate was available in 3 different variations, one of which was particularly elegant, a quiet queen move that would have been a fittingly poetic end. But Lyudmila didn't choose that one. Guided by my logic, she chose the most grinding, utilitarian, and humiliating path. A slow advance of a pawn, a final crushing demonstration of his utter helplessness. Victor saw it coming. He didn't let her deliver the final blow. With a shaking hand, he reached out and tipped over his own king. The universal sign of surrender, a wave of stunned silence washed over the massive auditorium, followed by a scattered, uncertain applause. It was over. The aftermath was a blur of controlled chaos. The CEO of Kronos Corp, a man named Marcus Thorne, was beaming, shaking hands with everyone in the control room. The media was in a frenzy, but the moment of true vindication, the real confrontation, was yet to come. It happened at the post-match press conference. Victor was there, looking like a ghost. He was pale, drawn, his eyes hollow. He mumbled a few words about the machine's strength, about the future of chess. He was a broken man, a monument turned to dust. Then Marcus Thorne took the stage. He praised his team, talked about the triumph of human ingenuity, and then he said, "And I'd like to bring up the lead architect of Lyudmila's strategic engine, the mind behind tonight's victory, Amelia Reed." My heart hammered against my ribs, but my steps were steady as I walked to the podium. The lights were blinding. I saw hundreds of faces, thousands of camera flashes. I felt a strange sense of calm. This was just another board, another set of moves. A reporter from a major newspaper stood up. "Miss Reed, an incredible achievement. The world is stunned. Can you comment on the AI's opening strategy? The Ghost's Gambit, some are calling it." It was so unorthodox, so personal. It seemed designed to provoke a very specific response. What was the philosophy behind it? This was it, the final move. I looked straight into the main broadcast camera, knowing that somewhere Victor was watching. I took a breath. "Thank you," I said, my voice clear and even, amplified throughout the hall and across the world. Ludamala's core philosophy is not based on aggression or provocation. It's based on a perfect objective understanding of a position's potential. We found through millions of simulations that what some might call a killer instinct is often just a liability. It's a predictable, emotional flaw in an otherwise logical system. The goal was to create a player free of that flaw. A player who relies on patience, on deep calculation, and on the quietest moves to control the board. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I had taken his insult, his very definition of my failure, and turned it into the foundational principle of his defeat. I had turned his weapon back on him. I didn't need to say his name. I didn't need to be emotional. The message was delivered with the cold, irrefutable precision of a checkmate. I saw a flicker of comprehension, of pure agony in Victor's eyes before he was led away from the stage. My new reality had begun. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A single text message from a number I knew well. It was from Elias. It contained a single word: checkmate. In the weeks that followed, my life transformed. I was no longer Amelia Reed, the forgotten pupil. I was the woman who had architected the fall of a titan. Offers poured in from other tech companies, from government agencies, from universities that had once dismissed me for lacking dynamism. Viktor Morozov, as I had planned, was not destroyed. He was simply rendered irrelevant. He quietly retired from competitive chess, his legacy forever marked by an asterisk, the footnote to the story of the machine that had so completely and personally deconstructed him. He was a ghost in his own history. I chose my own path. I accepted a position leading a new AI research division at Kronos, with Elias as my partner. We had our own building, our own team, our own budget. We had a new kingdom built on a foundation of quiet, relentless logic. My office is clean, minimalist, full of light. On my desk, I have only one personal item. It's a small, framed printout of the final position of the game against Victor, the moment before he surrendered. A monument not to victory, but to a principle proven. It was never about revenge. I still tell myself that, and today I believe it more than ever. Revenge is a hot, messy, emotional act. It's a fire that consumes the person who wields it. What I did was cold, clean, and precise. It was an act of creation. I didn't want to destroy him. I wanted to prove him wrong. I wanted to demonstrate that the qualities he dismissed in me, patience, meticulousness, a preference for quiet depth over loud aggression, were not weaknesses. They were a different kind of strength, a more resilient, more powerful kind. He thought the world of strategy belonged to the lions, to the predators who roared and attacked. I built something that proved the world could be conquered by the spiders, by the patient architects who weave their webs in silence and simply wait. And that's the moral of this story, the reason I wanted to share it with all of you. There will be people in your life, bosses, mentors, figures of authority, who will try to define you. They will tell you that you lack something essential, that you're not loud enough, not aggressive enough, not ruthless enough to succeed in their world. They will try to write your story for you, and they will always cast you as a minor character. Do not let them. Do not accept their definition of strength. Your quiet work, your meticulous preparation, your dedication to your craft, the things they overlook and dismiss, that is not a liability, that is your superpower. Don't try to learn their game. Build your own. Design a system where your unique strengths are not just valued, but are the very foundation of victory. Let them have the noise. Let them have the drama and the ego. You just focus on the work. Build your web. And when the time is right, show them that silence, patience, and perfect logic are the most devastating weapons of all. Show them that the quietest move can echo the loudest. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated, please hit that like button and leave a comment below. It truly helps to build a community and to know we're not alone in these fights. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that their quiet work matters. And of course, if you want to hear more stories about turning the tables and reclaiming your power, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Until next time, keep building.